So we wrote this book, Thad Heckman and myself, A Full History of the Buckminster Fuller Dome Home here in Carbondale. And it came out last year. COVID kind of delayed the book signing. We're doing this coming Saturday, Barnes & Noble, August 14th. They were kind enough to reschedule. We think the book is still ready to get in people's hands. We're ready to sign it. All the proceeds from the book. I'm not making a dime. Thad's not making a dime. It's all going back to the Dome Home. And Thad has been the official architect for the home throughout the restoration for many, many years. I'm kind of a newcomer to the whole project. I was brought on originally just to author this book, or co-author this book, and now I'm part of the Bucky board, as we like to call it, because the home has made leaps and bounds, but we still have stuff to do inside and a lot of outside. As far as the fountain, the Fullers had a fountain out the front of the home, this large fence. We want to make it look as much as like it did when the Fullers lived there back in the 1960s.
Well, and I mean that restoration process, the accuracy of that. I remember John Davies saying that there's only like one thing, and it was like some sort of tape seam or something to that effect that was a waiver was sought for in terms of historical accuracy related to the historical registry listing. So that's pretty impressive in terms of how close to
the plan is to the goal is to take it back to how it was first built in 1960 as it is today. Some changes are made. It's more fuel efficient, for example, with power. It has fire smoke detectors and things like that. Some things are allowed to be updated, but we want to keep it back and make it as much as like it was when the Fullers lived there. They moved in 1960. They lived there till about 1970. It was their legal address till 1972, and that's what we're going back to. So
now I'm sure Thad told me
how
you got suckered into the whole project, but tell me again how you got suckered into the whole project.
This is the funny thing. I'm an SIU grad. I was here from 1988 to 1992. I knew during that time that Bucky had taught at SIU, but I never gave any thought about where Bucky might have lived. And I never knew that there was a dome home here in Carbondale. But when I was here at that time, the home was still in private hands. It was owned by a man named Mike Mitchell. It was a rental property. I lived over on Hester Street, as I mentioned, behind the rec center. I was never in that on Forest Avenue that I recall. And if I wasn't specifically looking for a dome home, I wouldn't have seen it. So I didn't know until years later I read something about this dome home in Carbondale being restored. And I called my brother, Les Odell, who's lived in Carbondale his entire adult life, basically. I said, where is this thing? And then I assumed, oh, it must be out in the country someplace, out in the edge of town. No, it's right there in like this normal neighborhood, And so I was here visiting my brother and his family, and we were out and driving around. I said, Les, drive me by the Bucky Dome. And he did. And I was like, that's it. So sometime later, I was coming back to Carbondale. I have a lot of ties here to Carbondale. And I asked to have a tour of it. And that's when I first met Thad Heckman. And at that time, that's when the overdome was over the home, protecting it. The part of the roof had caved in. There was a big pole in the living room holding the roof up. This does not look like that.
The storied pole.
Yes,
There's been multiple mentions so far on the podcast of the storied
Constantly,
pole.
Don't hit your head on that, But even in that sort of condition, it was still very impressive to me. And what struck me so much is how spacious it felt inside. Standing outside, it doesn't look like a big house. And it's not a big house. It's only a one-bedroom house, really. But I never felt claustrophobic in it. And I had just done and had published another book, and Thad Heckman had mentioned to me that they were wanting to get their history kind of recorded. And it was all, Buck would say, synergy, and we partnered on that together. And I did kind of most of the writing part, but I needed Thad to certainly walk me through the architecture and the mathematics. I was already a TV major. I was an English major. I can't do this math. I was like, Thad, you got to dumb that down for me, okay? And it's important that the book is really, it's not a textbook. It's very much is about, it's about how the house was built, but it's about all the people who's lived in it and all the people who helped build it and help restore it. So it's a very approachable book, which is what I wanted.
Awesome.
So that's how it happened. And the book took many years to put together, and longer than I expected. And the story was when I first wrote it, I said, I'm not sure I can get 200 pages out of this. So the first draft is dripping with adverbs. It is so wordy. It is so, because I'm trying to pad everything. And eventually it got too long. We had to cut it, a little bit so that we could get it within the parameters that the publisher wanted and include all the pictures that we wanted, because we have some great pictures we wanted to include. So we had to cut it down. That's how much this sort of mushroomed, because it is the story of building, but the story of Fuller, his time in Carbondale, the story of his wife's time in Carbondale, all of his time teaching, then all the people who came into the home afterwards, like Mike Mitchell, he bought it. The home's only had 3 owners, which is kind of interesting in this day and age of short sales and house flips. They've had Fuller and his wife, a man named Mike Mitchell, who owned it for 28 years, and now the group that owns it now, that is the not-for-profit. That's it. It's had a lot of residents over the years because after Mike Mitchell lived there, or Mickey Mitchell, as he goes by now, lived there for about 2 years, he turned into a rental property. And they had many renters. And at first it was mostly professionals, grown-up professionals and professors from university. Then as more and more the faculty moved out to Marion and Murfreesboro and whatever, students started living there. And it was fun to track all of them down. And even though they didn't have a lot of money, they all were a lot of love and a lot of care. They all wanted to preserve the home. They knew how special it was, how lucky they were there to be living in Buckminster Fuller's home.
Really?
So, they did what they could it was also a cool house to live in, but they also did what they could to aid in its preservation. But students don't have deep pockets, but they did what they could. And everybody I talked to, they were fun to track down and say, oh yeah, I lived in Bucky's house, I loved it, and how did they first find it, and how did they first hear Bucky Fuller and stuff like that. So,
That is so much to just engage with.
Yes.
Which is what I think this whole podcast is going to be, is a lot to engage with. Episode 82 of the WTF Carbondale podcast, where we talk to interesting people about their interesting lives, and we tie it all back to this little old place we call home, Carbondale, Illinois, and somebody who has called this place home. I would still say that, Cary, you call Carbondale home.
Certainly Illinois, certainly southern Illinois. I live in Culpeper, Virginia. I work for the Library of Congress. I've been out there for over 20 years, but my roots, I grew up in Illinois. My family is from Marion County, but I have a lot of ties, like I said, to Carbondale. My uncle was Frank Black, longtime owner of Vola Ford. His wife, Marilyn, still lives here. Just had lunch with her and her daughter, Rhonda, today. My brother, Les Odell, all of his family. He works for the Southern. His family lives here. And even before that, I am a multi-generational Saluki. My grandparents, both my grandmother and my grandfather, graduated from SIU. My dad, my aunt, 2 of my aunts all graduated from SIU. My brother and I graduated from SIU, and now his children have graduated from SIU.
You are part of dynasty
I
building.
know. And I believe that my brother's youngest daughter, or only daughter actually, Sarah, her degree is in possibly in agriculture or something. So it's like in the same field that my brother and my dad was in. So and my grandfather. That's 4 generations. I broke out. I went into English and radio TV. My grandmother had a teaching degree, and my Aunt Marilyn had a teaching degree, and my other aunt had a journalism degree.
Is it kind of cool to see stuff like this that is just pop-up studio work, where you can take something like this space here, right, behind this tower, in this, what is... at this point, the more stories I hear, the more I understand this place to really be historic in the sense of this is where people's memories live. This is where people's history exists in this town. But to see stuff like this just be capable in this day and age versus what R&T may have been during your experiences.
Yeah, well, I have a master's degree in what we then called telecommunications. And it's kind of odd thinking back of that, because that was really kind of pre-internet. I'm dating myself, and we were talking about, a lot of the stuff we were talking about was coming up, but it was very speculative. We didn't know, well, people really want to, people want to watch the same TV show every week, the same time. That's what they like. That's, don't be silly. Now it's so different, things like that. So, and people, I don't know, people can get rid of their yellow pages? I don't think so. We were just very, but we had no idea, so... Anyway.
And here just is, but I mean, it all goes back even further, right? Where you guys were just talking about what it was going to look like from then to now, right? Buckminster Fuller, tying all things together.
Well, he was a futurist, of course. At one time, Bucky, I mean, is talk about a multi-hyphenate. I mean, a philosopher, writer, teacher, poet. At one time, his entry in Who's Who, remember the old Who's Who's directory, was the longest on record. that's how much he did and accomplished, and all these different hats that he wore and everything like that. So yeah, he's looking towards the future. He was looking at the future long before the rest of us were.
Yeah.
So yeah, imagine what he'd make of today, with all this, with people flying into space of their own, with their own dollar and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like he'd probably be totally down with that. So yeah.
Just to see that people would go.
He'd probably be a little disappointed that we don't have more dome homes in Carbondale and other places.
I mean, just in general, kind of the surprise that the dome home did not take off as something that was a more embraced structure.
There's another dome home here in Carbondale, and Bucky never lived in that, so that makes it a little less special, I think. But anyway, but also, interestingly, the geodesic dome, the thing that Bucky possibly didn't invent but certainly helped refine and publicize, covers more square footage on the planet Earth than any other work by any other architecture, because you've got these huge stadiums that are domes. You've got all these tents that are domes. You have all these centers that are domes, And it's fun now. Of course, we had the Synergy Dome here in Carbondale at one time. I think it was gone, I don't know when it was dismantled, but it's fun now because we do a lot of stuff on the Facebook about Bucky and the Dome Home, and all these stories are coming out. Oh yeah, we used to go trick-or-treating to Bucky's house, and oh, I mowed the lawn one summer, and it's fun, because he really was right there in the community and in the town. He interacted with people. He wasn't here a lot. He traveled extensively. He had this unique deal with the university that required him only to be on campus for like 2 months a year, and they didn't have to be all together. So he would come in for a week, he would teach, he would do do a speech, a lecture, then he would fly back out someplace, Europe, England, India, Asia, Japan. He loved Japan, he loved the Orient. But his wife was always here. But then he would come back. When I first learned that Bucky taught at SIU, I figured that he was only here for maybe 2 years or something. No, he was here for a decade. And then after he left here, he was affiliated with SIUE for 2 years. So that was a pretty lengthy amount of time. That's a significant part of his life as Buckminster Fuller, And he was very prolific as an author. He published numerous books during his time at SIU. He also secured 16 patents while he was here, which is a kind of a superhuman thing. Some people only get one patent in their life, and they're happy. To have 16, not just automobiles like the Dymaxion cars and buildings, but like rowboats and all these things used in construction and things like that. The idea of sustainability, of homes that work with the environment and not against the environment. I mean, this is stuff we're talking about now. That stuff Bucky was talking about in 1960, actually before, all the way back to his building of the Dymaxion house and things like that.
How much does activity like that play into the modern SIU system from what you've observed? Is there any connection that you've seen between the then and the now?
I think Bucky's only now I think a genius is never fully appreciated during their lifetime, and I now think that with Bucky having passed on many years ago, I think that SIU is now really making the most. And I think the homecoming back the way it was is helping with that, because we're the actual center. This is where Bucky lived. This is where he slept. This is where he called home. He ate his meals. He wrote his books there, at the kitchen table, I assume, or up in the study on the second floor. And I think SIU is now learning to make the most of their Bucky connection.
Yeah.
Probably their most famous. They've had some very wonderful alumni and famous former professors like Richard Russo, who I got to study with at one time, and Catherine Durham and people like that, Marjorie Lawrence. But I mean, Bucky's up there, and I think there's also a name that, because he was involved in so many fields, the first time I heard the name Buckminster Fuller was not in an architecture class, it was not in an engineering class, it was in an art appreciation class, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, that he covered all these fields, and that's why so many people are attracted to Buckminster Fuller and his philosophy, and that's why that's the name that we have to get out about Carbondale and his connection to Carbondale. Yeah. And it wasn't just like I said, he was here for over 10 years. He did a lot of work while he was here. So it wasn't just he passed through, casually. No, this was his legal, this is the only home he and his wife ever owned. Owned, yes, every place else he rented. Huh. So yeah, this was not only the only dome he ever lived in, the only dome he ever lived in, but also the only home he and his wife ever owned.
Being a multi-dimensional person yourself, did that help kind of track along with?
I think so. I was always fascinated from the minute I heard about Bucky, and I've always been sort of intrigued by the aesthetic quality of the geodesic dome and things like that. So, I'm interested. Yeah, I was pretty interested in him. Yeah, I don't know if I'm not nearly as multidimensional as him, but I dabble in a lot of things, and a lot of different writings and stuff like that. So I never planned to write a Buckminster Fuller book. It just sort of presented itself to me, and I thought, why not? And I'm so glad I did.
Yeah.
So,
Hey, what are some of the other pieces that you have authored leading up to this? Have they been in a similar vein, or?
No,
okay.
No. Well, not really. No, my first book I did like I mentioned, I got my master's degree in radio television.
Mm-hmm.
My thesis was about 12 important influential women in the history of television. Because when I took a wonderful history course, that was the class you would kind of start radio TV with, we learned about people like Sarnoff and Murrow and DeForest and Marconi, not one mention of a woman. And I was like, well, aren't there any women? So that's how that happened. And that thesis became my first book. And I added 3 more chapters, 3 more women. Some of them you've heard of, like Betty White, Lucille Ball. Mm-hmm. Some their work. Joan Gans Cooney founded the Children's Television Workshop, which created Sesame Street. Mm-hmm. Joan is still very much alive, Mm-hmm. One of the most important people in the history of television. Frida Hennick was the first woman added to the Federal Communications Commission, and it's largely thanks to her that we have public television. I won't go into all the details. It gets complicated there. So that was my first book. My second one probably be interesting to a lot of your listeners and watchers because it was about a lady named Virginia Marmaduke, mm-hmm. the great Chicago newspaper woman, an SIU booster, mm-hmm. and humanitarian. When I was at Radio TV, Virginia was still alive. She was living up in Pinckneyville. She used to come to campus a lot mm-hmm. for events and things like that. She couldn't drive herself, and she needed someone to kind of lean on. Mm-hmm. So a lot of us young men in either journalism or radio TV, uh-huh. we need to have a get together. We need to have a convention someday. There's a lot of us over the years. We'd go up to get a car. We would drive up, get Virginia at her apartment in Pinckneyville, where she lived she lived in a weird house that it wasn't a separate apartment, but there was like 4 apartments, and it was like all these 4 elderly ladies. It was very Golden Girls, but anyway, and we would bring her to SIU, and we would escort her to these events and things like that. And so I worked for the chairman, Dr. Joe Foote of the radio mm-hmm. TV department, so they knew me. Sometimes Virginia's escorts were she endowed a lot of scholarships, mm-hmm. and there were obviously to be scholarship recipients and stuff like that. I never got a scholarship. I never worked that hard, but I was never that bright or something. But anyway, they knew me in the Department of Radio TV and trusted me to go get her, and we got along like a house of fire. And so I always stayed in contact with her long after I graduated, and I came and I did an oral history with her one time, sitting in her living room in Pinckneyville. And then she developed Alzheimer's, unfortunately, which is very tragic. It's always like these great, sharp, wonderful minds that get stolen from us early. It's very unfair. But I got to be curious, and just after I moved out to D.C., to read some of Virginia's old newspaper articles, because we all knew her and we knew her story, but no one ever really read anything she wrote. This was before the internet, really. This was before newspapers.com. So I would schlep down to the Library of Congress before I worked there and go through microfilm. Remember microfilm? Remember microfilm? You'd sit there.
32-year-old me totally remembers microfilm.
Oh, yes. Sure. Mm-hmm. Well, they used this thing called microfilm, and it was a pain. And I would schlep down to the Library of Congress, and I would retrieve all these articles with her byline. And that was the second book that I did. And it was called Virginia Marmaduke, A Journey in Print from Carbondale, because she was born in Carbondale, to Chicago. And it traced not only articles by her, but articles mentioning her. And so that was a wonderful book to work on. And that came out in 2001, somewhere around that time. Yeah. So.
What does it feel like to be so close to the subject that you're creating media around?
It was wonderful with Virginia because I learned a lot about her. They always say, don't learn too much about your heroes. Yeah. It did not affect me. It did not. In fact, I came out respecting her more and liking her more mm-hmm. because I uncovered so many articles about her humanity. That's why when I always describe her, I say, Chicago newspaper woman, SIU booster, but humanitarian. That's, she endowed so many scholarships. She helped so many causes. SIU was a pet cause. SIU was lucky to have her mm-hmm. for all that. She had a lot of energy, and she devoted it to SIU. When she retired from Chicago journalism. She moved down to Pinckneyville. She attended SIU briefly as a young woman, but she never graduated from this. But that didn't stop her. She adopted it as her favorite cause, and they were lucky to have her, and they should appreciate her, for everything that she did. And then even when she passed away, she endowed, I think it was $2 million some to the university, to the radio TV department and journalism schools. And I think that says something about her as well, because sometimes these people in journalism, I won't name names, but they get kind of old and kind of cranky, and they see a lot of stuff, in their lives. They see a lot of stuff, and sometimes they can get kind of bitter. But I think it says something about Virginia and her spirit that she didn't become that way. In fact, she believed it was so important that she continued to help young journalists, broadcast or print or whatever, follow in her footsteps and follow in that field. She didn't become bitter or jaded about it. In fact, she laid the groundwork for many others to follow in those footsteps. So, yeah.
And it's not easy to not get jaded.
I know.
Like, now is one thing. I'm sure then was a whole different
Well, she was like,
too.
she was the first female crime reporter for a major Windy City daily, and she would go out to these horrific crime scenes and things like that. She covered mobsters and all sorts of things. So, you can become pretty jaded pretty quickly with all of that. And she didn't let it happen to her. I remember she was always upbeat when I knew her, and always giving to SIU and things like that. And like I said, there was a lot of us guys who escorted her, and sometimes they were, and she also would pick some seniors from Pinckneyville. Like I said, we need to have a convention someday. But we
that's just a
and that was book number 2. And then I wrote a book called June Cleaver Was a Feminist, which reevaluates the fictional portrayals of women on television. And I worked on that for many years. And what I find is that many of these women were not the Stepford wives that we thought they were. Very smart, very capable. A lot of people say, well, there was no, CNN unfortunately just did this broadcast, this look at the sitcom, and I think it's very affectionate, but it a little bit myopic and a little narrow. They like to think, oh, Mary Tyler Moore was the first working woman on television. Not by a long shot. We had working women on television in like 1949. I mean, we had single mothers on TV in 1955. We had a first female police officer on a show called Decoy in 1950, great series with Beverly Garland. And it was my hope to kind of bring those women into the canon, because it changes not only how we think about women on TV in that era and the actresses who played them, but it changes how we think about the real life women who watched them. You know what I'm saying? Because they had to be inspired. They saw something in them that they recognized as well. So,
what draws you to women's influence in media?
I don't know what happened there. I guess I just followed the path. I told you how I became interested in women behind the scenes, and so I did that. Then my first job out of college, out of SIU, was at the Museum of Broadcast Communications in Chicago, and they hired me to co-curate an exhibit. I don't think they paid too much attention to the topic of the thesis, because they wanted me to do something about the images of women on television. So I said, okay, I'll do it. But I came in there with this sort of jaundiced view that I was reading in the popular press, and sadly often in the so-called scholarly press, that said all women in TV in 1950 were these housewives who never really said anything beyond yes dear or whatever like that. When I joined the Museum of Broadcast Communications, this was again before the internet, before YouTube and all of that, where you can see so many. I got to watch shows that I'd not ever seen before, like the aforementioned Decoy, this wonderful show that I love with a policewoman as the lead character and the only character in the show. But I got to rewatch shows like Leave It to Beaver, The Donna Reed Show, I Love Lucy, and other shows that are not really that broadly syndicated anymore. And I realized, like, these ladies are kind of smart. These ladies are getting the last. These ladies are not taking any gruff from their husbands or things like that. And it totally opened my eyes. I was like, well, what else have I missed? And so that's when I sort of broke with the common thread of it. I got very excited. And then to go back and look and see women in 1950s and 60s television in sci-fi roles, in playing roles that in jobs that we do not think traditionally women, like press secretaries. There was a show called Nancy with Celeste Holm as a press secretary. Earlier, Celeste Holm had played a newspaper woman. Great show called Wire Service with Mercedes McCambridge as a single newspaper woman. She reminds me a little bit of my Aunt Kathy, the aforementioned. She was a newspaper over in Chicago, over in St. Louis for many, many years. Great shows with these strong independent women that, because they have not been rebroadcast 1/10 as much as maybe Brady Bunch or June Cleaver and Leave It to Beaver, we forget about them. and then it becomes very easy to forget about them. But even June Cleaver, that's the name of the book, is June Cleaver was a feminist. If you watch shows like that, she's a pretty savvy character. I got to interview Barbara Billingsley before her passing as well, and she was a pretty savvy character as well.
How does the components that you study that aren't kind of part of the common conversation around classic media, right? How do you see that impacting media in today's space?
It's going to get even worse because we are putting out such an extraordinary level of product. I mean, it is just people forget. Back in the remember the day, you're too young. There was days I grew up with like 10 channels. You were lucky if you got 10 channels clear. Okay, and I was lucky that my mother indulged me to watch my TV watching, so that I, had this base to build on once I got. But in some ways it's easier because we do have YouTube and Netflix and all these shows that we can almost call up with the snap of a finger. But because there's so much product there, but we've got to go back to the product. We just can't accept what even the best journalists and sometimes even media professors are saying about these things. Don't take their word for it. If it says that June Cleaver was oppressed or the mom on Father Knows Best was oppressed and kowtowing to her husband, watch the shows and you'll be very, very surprised. Because June Cleaver and Donna Reed have become such shorthand for a type of Stepford wife, and unfortunately it doesn't really apply to either of them. Go back, watch the shows. In some ways it's easier now than ever before, because you can call it up on your TV or your computer very, very easily. But it was, but now it's so hard because there's so much product coming out.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about how kind of the discourse misrepresents the reality here, and how really we don't necessarily shape our thoughts around the actual media as much as we shape our minds around the perception of the media that we talk about actualizing.
When someone says, there's a wonderful line in a Adrian Rich poem. It's like, I've come for the thing itself and not the myth. So that's where you've got to go back to the original. Don't always believe, you can't always believe what you read. We know that. I mean, but you've got to go back to the original. It's eye-opening and it's fun to see how strong some of these women characters were, how diverse they were. And I mean diverse, not always in race. That's a different topic altogether. Women of color had to fight a major battle just to be represented on television, especially in non-stereotypical roles. But diverse in terms of occupations that they held, types of families that they were in charge of, types of families that they were maternal towards, It's really eye-opening, and it was really exciting. And in fact, the biggest criticism that I get about the June Cleaver book now is that it's too dense. There's too much in it. I was like, I know, but I kept finding new and wonderful series and wonderful actresses and wonderful portrayals, and I wanted to put them in there. And finally, I did realize, I said, Cary, you don't have to mention everybody. You just got to build a case. So a way that an attorney would build the case in a court. So I've done. Hopefully, that's what I did. But and I'm still pleasantly surprised when I see certain shows that I'm not familiar with, and now working at the Library of Congress in the Motion Picture and Recorded Sound Division, I'm very lucky now that I get to see, very easy access to some stuff, because there's still a lot of stuff that isn't out there. That's the next thing we're fighting. Well, it's not on YouTube. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist or that it's not important. It means it's tied up with its copyright or something, or they're on 2-inch videotape, which is very arcane format and things like that. They needing preservation and stuff like that. Case in point, there's a wonderful show. It was Mary Tyler Moore before Mary Tyler Moore. It was called Meet Millie. It was on in 1954. It ran for several seasons, very successful. Elena Verdugo played a working woman, unmarried, not with a steady boyfriend, very independent. It's really, and at one time, there's believed that show was on like 2 or 3 seasons. They think only 3 episodes are still alive, or still around. CBS needed more room in their vault at one time. They pulled the films and destroyed them. Yes. We deal a lot with lost media at the Library of Congress.
I mean, it's the lost media thing is going to be something that exists at all levels.
Yes.
Right? I mean, here, Carbondale, talking about destroying microfilm of the paper of record for 150 some odd years. Kara was telling me about that when she got the phone call. I'm not going to delve into too much of this right now, but I mean, it's just hearing something like that, thinking, I don't care if it there's gotta be a way for us to just actually like really record history, not just again, do you look at the books on the shelves in the library as thoughts around the way that we think about the thing, not the thing itself, and is the reporting from the newspapers the actual thing itself? And if we lose that, we lose
in some
our
ways,
ability
that's
to
all we have
context.
left. Well, going back to Virginia Marmaduke, she had a career in radio and television in Chicago, and I've only ever found. At the time the book came out, I hadn't found any of that stuff. At one time, she supposedly interviewed the Queen of England on a trip the Queen made to Chicago, but we've never found the recording of that. It was only a few years ago that someone contacted me, and they said, I'm about to sell this on eBay, but I saw that you wrote a book about this lady. These are some audio recordings of her show. Do you want them? I said, yes, I want them. So we got them, and we donated them to, I believe, we did donate to Morse Library here at SIU. Because they have a lot of Virginia material.
What kind of technology does it take to be able to effectively achieve your mission of the Library of Congress in this day and age?
I'm not really a techie, so I'm not the best person to say, but we are having a lot of problems with dead formats. I mean, and more so now than ever before. I've done a lot of work over the year with another name you don't know, but some of your listeners might, David Susskind. David Susskind had a very, very long career as a talk show host. I've been affiliated with his estate for many years. The first job I had in Chicago, the largest collection they had was David Susskind. So I got to know the family during the 5 years that I was there, all on these 2-inch videotape. Now the home VHS tapes is 1/2 inch. Now, even that is dead, right? You don't have that. You can imagine what 2-inch was. 2-inch are these big, heavy things. I think there's only probably 5 or 6 working 2-inch machines left in the United States. One is at the library, a couple are at the Library of Congress. I believe there's one in Tennessee. I think one is maybe at UCLA in Hollywood. But there are thousands of 2-inch tapes still lying around. And so I've been working for many years trying to get some of these David Susskind stuff. The Library of Congress has some David Susskind material as well. I joke the man will follow me to my grave, but that's fine. That's fine. I'm happy to do that because they're really interesting. David died in like 1986. So the shows that he did, maybe in the 1970s, at that time, people didn't realize how historically important they were. But now we found this show about, there's this odd disease that seems to be affecting mainly gay men. David did a show on that when we know that now is the AIDS crisis, and things like that. He did shows about Vietnam veterans coming back and feeling, having difficulty reassimilating and things like that. Maybe in 1980 that wasn't a big concern. Now we're a little bit more woke about that, and that's more interesting now. He did a lot of stuff about gender back in his day, about transsexuals and transvestites and things like that. I mean, he was really at the vanguard of a lot of that stuff, and they're all on these 2-inch tapes. There's also a 1-inch videotape that is also becoming 2 inches really dead. That's like the dinosaur. That's the dinosaur of it. 1-inch tape, 3/4 inch videotape, and then of course VHS tape. That's just stuff that people used to have at the house, But think of all the stuff that people recorded that could be interesting, that was shot on VHS tape, I mean, news things, and at one time that was the method of news gathering, with stuff like that. So now we have digital stuff and things that are born digital, and there's certain born digital material, as it's called, has its own issues with preservation and things like that. Mainly, a lot of it saying, no, if you create it, it could have value. Don't just erase it, just don't discard it. It could have value. We have to convey to people that the stuff that they're creating is important content. Maybe not today, but like I was saying with Susskind, in 20 years, it could be a really important historic snapshot.
Well, and here's what I'm trying to navigate now is, what does preservation look like 20 years from now? Is simply having spread your content across 5 or 7 different platforms with an assumption or a hope that one of those platforms will exist up till a point at which the media that you've created now requires reference in order to provide value and context to the immediate now, which at our point in time is the future.
Yeah, exactly. I concur. It's very complicated because none of us can see the future. So it's like when I was in, getting my master's degree, and we were talking about things like we were talking about, like content providers and stuff like that, and would the end of course people have been talking about the end of the three major networks for years and years and years. We were predicting that back then. I always kind of thought, no, I think people like the networks, and as long as the networks, the three major networks, are giving them something that they can't get elsewhere, and they still are. They're getting the Olympics and places like that. They're getting morning news. They're getting daytime content. They're getting late night. That stuff is not happening across the board on all these other channels. In fact, for years and years and years, all these cable channels were showing nothing more, or a lot of their content was reruns pulled from the networks. They were showing. USA Today still seems to thrive on SVU reruns, which is fine. I love that show. But it's like, their content is coming from the networks. So,
well, I think I don't know if historical is the right word, but a institutional.
Yes.
An institutional advantage that ABC, NBC, and CBS have over anything that started in the 80s up till now.
Yes.
Right, is that they have always had to be the mirror as far as media is concerned, right?
Yes.
That when media was simply a reflection with some entertainment and not entertainment first with reflection kind of on the back burner through news and other, kind of introspective, kind of human-centric media creation, that they understand this and that they can reflect that in their modern iterations in a way that others can't, right? And now that the three big networks are really in the digital sync together with Paramount Plus, with Hulu, and with Peacock, right? I think we're about to see not so much a rapid change in the landscape as much as we'll see kind of just a more reparative, like they will bring to this modern digital space some of the introspection that it's lacking, right? That now we will be seeing back at ourselves through this media, because they'll serve us the news in a particular way. They'll serve us, these sitcoms and these types of programs that were always meant as kind of a look at yourself type of activities.
Well, so I was just talking about that sitcom thing that CNN did. That wasn't about CNN's history. That wasn't about Fox's history. That wasn't about MTV's history. That was about network TV history. That's so that's the legacy that they can build on. I love it when shows like Meet the Press and CBS This Morning or Sunday Morning make use of their history and things like that. I would love, bring this full circle. CBS came and interviewed Buckminster Fuller in the Bucky Dome. Walter Cronkite came to town, sat down with Bucky in the house. So I keep saying that Jane Pauley and her crew from CBS need to come and see the Dome now. And I said, by the way, I can get you your opening shot. Okay, I have your opening shot. It's Walter Cronkite sitting with Bucky in the Dome. So I think that'd be a wonderful full circle moment for them, and good publicity for the Dome as well. So,
well, I mean, and here's the deal, right? It's not that these things aren't within striking distance. When we finally put together the care package to send to Jeff Bridges, right? It took about 3-4 months to get a reply from his assistant, Becky Pedretti.
Yes.
And she was just like, listen, and this was by this time, pandemic had rolled around, right? Jeff's got his, his additional health concerns. So it's very kind and soft provision, but especially after our conversation, Cary, like, I'm going to email Becky back and like send her, hey, here's just some really cool things. Right. And like, what would be cooler than, CBS coming in, and it was Walter Cronkite with CBS. It was Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Just double checking.
They interviewed him for a documentary about the cities of the future, but they had so much good footage, it seems. They later incorporated that into some other stuff that they broadcast, and even into a film that was released to schools.
Wow.
Yeah.
And we don't always think about some of those productions.
Yes.
That,
what we do at the Library of Congress, we collect a lot of that sort of industrial films and films that were made for use in churches and schools, stuff like that. I work mainly at the library with something called the National Film Registry, which is 25 films named every year, handpicked or picked by the Librarian of Congress.
Yeah.
And yes, there's the big blockbusters like Titanic and Frankenstein and Gone with the Wind and Casablanca, but it's also those other films that are, again, we're very reflective of our nation and very historically important. Things like Duck and Cover, a couple of years ago, they added this film that you and I never saw, but it was called The Story of Menstruation. And it was shown it was produced by the Walt Disney Company. It was showing in schools to young girls. All the boys were sent off to play dodgeball, and all the girls were pulled in, and every woman at the Library of Congress in our office was like, oh yeah, we watched that.
Wow.
And, we watched all sorts of generations. They made use of it forever and ever and ever. And it was estimated that by the time it was pulled out of circulation, it had been seen by over 100 million women.
That's wild.
Yes, you can find it on YouTube now, so you can go hunting for it. It's an animated work, but Disney produced it.
Yeah.
And it's not graphic or anything like that. It's very, that's it. That was added a few years ago. And then we'd love to add artistic avant-garde films. And you look at them and you think, boy, this is kind of strange. And you think, boy, this is strange. And then you find out this was made in like 1927. And you're like, wow. And then you look deeper and you say, I see David Lynch in that. I see Quentin Tarantino in that. I see where that seed began, that imagery began, and where it went to.
Well, does it feel like almost having the position of the giver, right, in the role that you have?
That it is, because the idea is to focus attention by the nation on film preservation, because again, so many films. I'm doing some work right now on an ABC series that was on in the 1970s. It was called the ABC Wide World of Mystery. It was a late night alternative that ABC did to Johnny Carson. And it was all these original films that they produced with murder, mayhem, ghosts, things like that. Some are on YouTube. They produced 36 of them, I believe, maybe more than that. And a lot of those masters we believe to be lost. That's remarkable for network television in 1970. They were probably shot on videotape. The videotapes may have been wiped and recycled. We're used to a lot of silent films being lost, but films from the 1970s being lost. So we're getting ready to do a blog post about that at the library. We're going to list all these films and say, do you have this? Did you happen to record this off air? And most of them would have aired before home video really caught on. But there may be a few geeks out there who had the home devices or somehow got a copy, and we want to unearth them so that they are not gone forever.
Do you feel like you get enough media attention from larger entities like helping you kind of give them?
I always need a lot of attention, but that's not being the truth. But we do the National Film Registry every year. That comes out in usually December. And then we do, the thing I work on mostly is the National Recording Registry. That's 25 recordings. And last year, and we've added everything from the Beatles to operas, Leontyne Price, country music, radio broadcasts, all sorts of stuff. Even a bird call or a sound of a bird from a bird that may or may not be extinct. It's very interesting. But anyway, we release that usually April, and we get wonderful news coverage on that. We've even been a category on Jeopardy. You can't ask for further that, can you?
Okay, so let's talk about Jeopardy right now, because you don't like Matamodio.
Oh, I don't. I'm probably okay. I'm jealous of his smarts and his money. I will admit that, but I like a little more gameplay. I don't, and God bless him. And
he just wants and clears out the board.
He just clears out the board. I don't think it's as much fun as when everyone gets to be in there and play. I'm sure he's a very nice guy. He seems like a nice guy. I don't think he's like, but yeah, you saw that on my Facebook, didn't you?
I did. I couldn't help it. I've been thinking about it this whole time, and he just keeps winning, and we just
Is he still winning? I haven't seen it this week at all because I've been traveling.
I haven't watched today, but he's still. I mean, he's now like 6th most winningest all time.
Yeah.
The craziest thing, and this is something that will, I think, end up in your guys' hands at the Library of Congress, is that he has been a champion across 4
hosts, 4 different hosts. Yes.
And that's legitimately a record that will never be broken.
Probably, yes.
That is something absolutely miraculous.
I think he seems like a nice guy. I think he's got a nice personality. And I'm probably just jealous. And if he and I take back everything. If he wants to make a donation to the Bucky Dome, I take everything back. I'm happy we'll take his money. But yeah, I just I just find it something very calculated. He always goes and he's playing what's his name's game. We remember the guy that won a couple years ago and dominated. He knows go for the big category, get the big mounts.
Yep.
Bet it all if you can. Get a head start and just leave the other people in the dust. I admire that good gameplay, but it's not as much fun to watch, is it?
as just going through 200,
Yeah,
400.
but it's not. But it's not as much fun to watch when the other people have a chance, you know. But I do. But he keeps winning, and he's got the smarts.
Yeah.
And some of those answers he comes out, I'm like, who knows that?
Yeah,
What?
and how? I mean, it's clearly one of those things where this has just been bred into him.
Yeah.
You know, professors for parents, and just like a being pointed at, you know, being able to devour any sort of information that's put in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Right, it's just it's cool, but yeah, no. So that's an awesome tie together. I love that. I absolutely love
we have
that,
been a
Gary.
category on Jeopardy several times. I work with the producer there. She's wonderful. Yes, she has gotten emails from me about which guest host I like the most. I'm sure, Michelle, I'm sure you're desperate to know what I think, and she's very funny about it and things like that. I said, no, I will not be auditioning because I cannot do. I actually attended. When Alex was alive, they did some in D.C. You know, and I attended. It was great fun, and I was like, I cannot do these pronunciations. I could never do those pronunciations like him.
Yeah.
I'd have no. I'd be like, we got to skip this one, guys. I can't.
Not for me.
Not for me.
Those.
I took a year of Spanish at SIU. I had to get it for my English degree, and it was all crammed in one summer. And when you learn it that fast, you forget it that fast. I don't remember any of it now.
But you still have a pretty sharp memory. I mean, we're sitting here, we're talking through things.
Yeah.
Arguably that you've had to process multiple times, right? Hearing it first, writing it down, editing it, reviewing it, and then regurgitating it over and over again to audiences who are interested in the media you produced. That makes sense as to why that would be. But I'm sure that affects your entire bandwidth of understanding.
Right. Well, we really, when the book was when the Bucky book was coming out, I put together a whole PowerPoint. We were hoping to go around and do it. Then COVID hit, you know. But then with the June Cleaver book, I've done a presentation several times, and it's great fun because I first show a comp reel, a videotape about 30 minutes long of a lot of clips from old TV shows. Some that they have seen, some that they've never seen. And it's very eye-opening because, I curated that in a way to see. You weren't used to seeing women like this, were you? We're not supposed to, and you see that the audiences of both sexes and various generations going, oh, I didn't know women like that talk to their husbands on TV in 1950. I'm like, yeah. As though they show that, and then I get up and do a PowerPoint things. I've done that many times, and they've allowed me even to do it at the Library of Congress one time. It was great fun, and then do Q&A from the audience.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, you were telling me before the podcast.
Yes.
About Buckminster Fuller actually being in this building.
Yes. Well, that was one of the fun things that we found. There's very little written about, how Bucky spent his time in his days here at SIU day and out. Like, he wasn't here a lot. Now, Anne, his wife, was here. And we also have to remember what Carbondale was like at that time. It was a much smaller town. The student population was much smaller. The mall was not there. Nothing out that side of town.
Yeah.
The other side of town would have ended about at Murdale, It was very well afforded. My uncle owned. I remember when he was downtown in the area, not out on the, towards Marion and things like that.
I love that those buildings are still standing like that.
Yes, that's great. We used to visit my Uncle Frank there at that when the dealership was there when we were little. But yeah, so there's a story we found somehow. Maybe I got to interview a lot of people that knew Bucky, all of Bucky's neighbors, kids that used to like trick or treat and mow his yard and stuff like that. And the Fullers were always the house to go to on Halloween because Ann Fuller gave away the full-size candy bars. I love that. When they told me that was the house every kid made a beeline for on Halloween, not the little ones, the big size. And so I thought, that's got to go in the book. But yes, Bucky. There's a story of him meeting somebody here, and he and his wife were coming to see when the Varsity was a movie theater, and they were seeing a Roman Polanski film. It's some sort of Knife in Water or something. I forgot the name of the film, but probably with subtitles. So kind of an artsy film that was playing in Carbondale, and there was that. Yes, so he visited the Varsity when he was here.
It's just wild to think of people who have set foot in this building throughout the years. I'm always and forever, and the more of these conversations that happen.
I don't think it was a movie theater when I was here. It was a video store when I was here. I remember that, but I don't think it was a movie theater. But I had a membership to the video store.
Well, I think, and I don't know the history on this place really all that well. Arguably, that's something I should get better at. But from what I understand, it was 1940 to 2003 when the movie spaces that are over here function, and maybe the storefront here was different, and then they still had the the rooms down the hallway as theaters, but I don't know for sure. I'd have to ask somebody, the people that have worked here. It's cool, like talking to folks that have been like, oh, well, I managed there from 70 to 73.
That's like the Bucky Dome. These people
and
come out of the woodwork in a way, and it's great. And I post on Facebook all the time, if you've got a story about the Dome, let us know. And then, of course, it was a rental property for many years. A lot of people came to parties there and things like that. So some of them probably, pretty energetic parties, let's say, so that's fun. So
you do a really good job of using all of the different Carbondale-centric Facebook groups to generate interest and activity. I mean, what's kind of the coolest outreach that you've had back to you from participation in those groups? Like people that have been like, oh, I've got a story for you.
Oh my gosh. We used it to track down a lot of the old renters, which is great. It's amazing what's out on the internet. I mean, what sort of public, and Mike Mitchell has been fantastic. When I started the book, I said, what if I can't track down the second owner of the Dome? Or if I can, what if he's not in it? I mean, do you want to talk about some house you don't own anymore? I was like, what if he does not in it? But he was so helpful, not only for the book, I'll get to your credit in a minute, but I'll get back to his, but also with the restoration, because he lived there. The Fullers are passed away. Their daughter Allegra never hardly visited the Fullers when they lived. She had her own life in California. The grandkids only visited a couple times. So really to get back to how the home was when the Fullers lived there, we had to go back to Mike Mitchell and what pictures he had, what memories he had. And the very first renter that Mike had was a woman named Michelle Bach, who studied dance here at SIU and is now just retired, and she lives out on the East Coast. And she's been fantastic because she said, well, when I moved in, this is what the door looked like, and this is what the shower was, and blah, blah, blah. So that stuff we've all kind of pieced together, thankfully. But yeah, I've joined all the big Facebook groups devoted to futurism, mid-century modern. I've got a big education in that because they were good friends with the Eames. And their home is just I posted a picture and I said, this house was a mid-century marvel. And then someone's supposed to say, it still is, and I belong to all the geodesic groups. And there used to be a group devoted to round houses, so we qualify. All the Carbondale groups and all the SIU groups and everybody. Like I said, a lot of stories are coming out. I'm trying to think of people who I've, probably a gentleman that had seen, it may have been your broadcast, somebody, and they said they'd heard it, and they said, oh yeah, I lived there, and he was not on our radar at all. We did not find any, most of it we'd found some sort of property record, sometimes even like a ticket from the city, and that is what sourced us back to tracking these people down. And they must have thought it was bizarre when I was calling them. I was like, did you used to live in Carbondale? I'm like, yes. Did you ever live in the Buckminster Fuller? I'm like, yeah. And then they get very excited. Yeah, we lived at the Bucky Dome, and things like that. But the gentleman reached out to us, and at first we thought he was kind of pulling our leg. But his facts were just too solid. I said, you can't know that stuff if you didn't live there.
Yeah.
So he helped continue the story. He was one of the last people who actually got to call the Dome home. Only a handful of people have been able to call it home, and he was one of them. And that was because of the media outreach that we did.
Wow. The where am I going with this question? It had to do with the archivist function of what you do, but I lost kind of the lead into that question. I said, I've been starstruck by this whole conversation here. It really is.
I'm very lucky. I've got to meet some really exceptional and be friends with wonderful people, and still am. So I'm sorry I didn't get to meet Bucky, but I got to know Allegra, his late daughter, who just passed away. Wonderful benefactor. Mickey Mitchell, fascinating man. Knew Bucky, was a big friend of Bucky's, moved out to California, was a musician for many years, helped manage, it wasn't the Whiskey A Go-Go, it was some sort of very large, well-known club out there. He worked with Lou Adler managing this. I'm like, Mickey, you need to write your book. You need to write your book about your life, because you've got some stories to tell. We very much want to bring him back to because he did so much to help the house. Him, Bill Perk, who you probably know, have done so much. That house would not be standing without those gentlemen. So we really want to bring Mickey back sometime and thank him and have him see the home as it is now, because he really does. It wouldn't have been saved. He made a promise to Bucky that he would take care of the house, and he did.
Yeah. And it's there.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
He could have been bulldozed a long time ago for someone who just wanted the lot. It's a good lot. It's a nice location. So, but luckily we had that little jewel now in Carbondale. So.
I'm hoping the same thing happens with the Lost Cross house. were you the old punk house on Elm Street? I want to say it started in like the early 80s. So 83, 85-ish. It was just like a punk show house. Like they would have bands and stuff in the basement.
What was the name of it?
Do what?
What was the name of it?
The Lost Cross.
No, I don't know. See, I studied in school. That was like the
Cary, what are you doing? What are you doing here?
I know that was like the bad. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Well, now I feel like you're gonna stumble into another Carbondale project on accident, Cary. No, it's cool.
Someday I got to do a project that's like actually close to where I live because it's exhausting. But but
sure.
that's okay. But this is the time to do it. You can do this stuff now. You can do Zoom calls and working at the Library of Congress have access to so much stuff that if I was in Carbondale, I wouldn't have access to. So I didn't know I don't know that one.
I'll send you. I've got episode 50. Patrick Hobeck.
Okay.
He was a good. He's a good introduction to the house. That I'll send you something. And then
okay.
It's kind of cool. Adam Fletcher, who is Adam's got to be probably in his like late 30s, mid 40s. The plays a band called the Copyrights. He really like works to document the Lost Cross house and its span of history. Because I mean, it's the oldest contiguously functioning punk house venue in the country.
Wow.
So there's like it's kind of this storied place, right?
That's cool.
And it's 3 blocks down from the Dome home.
Yes.
Right?
Wow. Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. No, I will definitely. This is something at the very least from a distance you can look at and just admire and go, oh, cool.
Virginia Marmaduke was born here in Carbondale. The house she was born in is still standing.
Wow.
I don't know who lives there, but it's still standing. She drove me by it one time.
Where
it is on Popular, I think.
Okay.
It's not that. It's kind of down that vicinity. So yeah, I don't remember the exact. But it's still standing.
Well, so. I would imagine it may be was it like a really beautiful turreted house? Like
may have been, yes. Okay. Her father worked for the railroad. He made a nice living, and so yeah.
No, I think that house may be getting some level of restoration.
Good.
But so I'll have to like drive up and down Poplar and just try and figure it out.
Yeah, I was just telling someone today that it's like there's this wonderful quote. I forgot the poet's like say it. The world is made of stories, not of atoms.
Yeah.
And it's so true. And I had such a great time being a family. My step-grandmother was the first woman from Marion County to join the WACs. And so
you're going to have to tell me what the WACs is,
was during World War II with the Women's Army Corps.
Okay.
It was a way of bringing women into the armed services so that bring men, and then they would do certain jobs so that men could be more on the front lines. And so this was this whole, very important to the feminist history of this country and things like that. And this was before she married my grandfather. She died when I was 2, so I have no memories of her, unfortunately. But my cousin had saved all of her letters home, all of her notebooks. She had never stepped foot out of this little county in southern Illinois. And then suddenly she finds herself on a ship going to Northern Africa, being stationed in Italy, and things like that. This incredible life story, and I'm so sad that I never got to meet her, or know her at all, because like I said, she died when I was 2. I have no memories of her. But my cousin was saved all this documentation of her, so I was able to write something about her a few years ago, which brought me great pleasure, So
well, exploring just a little bit that question I asked earlier, kind of what inspires the following of women in media and their influence here, but it sounds like you've had influential women in your life.
Absolutely. My God, yes.
Media.
My grandmother on my father's side, SIU grad, was a beloved English teacher. It's funny that my brother and I now, are writers. My aunt was a journalist. She was a beloved English teacher at Kimmondy Alma High for many, many years. Now they're getting old, but they still come to me and say, your grandmother put a love of literature and reading into me that I will never forget. Your grandmother was my English teacher, and she has so many wonderful letters that students sent to her and things and stuff like that. So yeah, that's how I mean, when you got women like that in your life, it's pretty interesting. So,
That really does kind of like tie it.
Yeah,
all
I think so. Yeah.
I'm Cary. One of the things that I really do with this podcast is I work to have limited expectations or like no expectations, but a lot of conversation and a lot of exploration, right? So I work this balance of not wanting to know too much about the people before I sit down with them, and I get to have these genuine responses myself to folks, and to have that genuine interaction, and to have had just enough interaction with you and just enough of a lead-in with the Buckminster Fuller activity and the Dome Home activity to be able to explore all of these other things has just made this conversation a treat.
It's been fun. And I got to tell you about the book I'm working on now.
Yeah.
It's a little north of here, and this is just something I stumbled on as well. It's a very complicated story, but around 1960, there's a man up in Louisville, Illinois, if you know that town, just south of Effingham. Not too far from Kinmundy, where my parents retired to, and my mother was born in Kinmundy, and they retired when they moved back down there. He founded in around 1959-60 his own religious colony. Some might call it a cult. He even went so far as to build his own kind of community. He built a replica of the Mount Vernon house, only 20% bigger. That is still standing in Louisville. I was working on the Bucky Dome book. I'd heard about this house over in Louisville. I thought, would that be an interesting little companion thing? You know, I'm going to write this. You know, I'm like, now another little architectural interesting thing.
Yeah.
And then I began exploring the story. And then I discovered the man who built this house, Johnny Bob Harrell, was still alive. I went over and interviewed him. I've interviewed him many times. He just passed away at the age of 99 earlier this year. It's a fascinating story. Fascinating story. I will have to come back and talk to you about that sometime.
Well, one of the things and then we'll outro on this. I think this is a really good kind of punctuation to our conversation here. Is what writing around people and structures kind of means to you, right? What we've was exploring the one component, the interest in women's influence in media, but for you it seems like you just find these connections between structures and the individuals that create them and inhabit them. And so
that's an interesting perspective. This was just I'm just insatiably curious, and I thought I was just going to write about a house, and then I went and met Johnny Bob, and I came to him pretty much under the pretext that I said, I'm just going to talk about that. If he wants to talk about other stuff, I'm down with it.
Yeah.
And we barely sat down on his front porch, and he began telling me about all this other stuff because he got in trouble with the government. He went to jail for a time. He had this compound. People stormed it. The government stormed it at one time because he was harboring a deserter. It's a very interesting story. And he started talking about it, and suddenly I went down in that direction. Just like one day I took a tour of the Bucky Dome, I stuck with that, and then I followed that direction. So.
And we hope you've enjoyed following us along in our direction for this conversation for the 82nd episode of the WTF Carbondale podcast. My guest, Cary Odell. Have a good one, folks, whatever that one may be.